The glass roof of the Whitmore Maternal Health Gala catches the late evening light and scatters it gold across marble floors and champagne glasses, across the string quartet tuning in the corner, across 300 guests who have no idea they are about to witness the one story in this room that nobody planned for. Nora stands beneath that light, one hand resting low on the curve of her belly, 3 lives moving beneath her palm in the restless, overlapping way they always move when she's been on her feet too long. She should sit down. She knows she should sit down. But the room is beautiful in a way that makes her forget, for a moment, to be careful with herself, and she lets herself simply stand there and breathe it in. She is not alone. She has not been alone in a long time. To her left, Ava straightens without hurry, the kind of stillness that belongs to a woman who has never needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. Her eyes move across the room, the way they move across a quarterly report, quickly, missing nothing. To her right, Rowan is already in motion, before Nora has even registered the faint dizziness at the edge of her vision, 2 fingers finding the pulse point at Nora's wrist, with the ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 more, without ever once making it feel routine. Behind them both, Celine steps forward and angles her body a half-turn toward the entrance, toward the woman who has just walked through the door and stopped dead in her tracks. Camille. Nora feels the name before she hears anyone say it. She feels it the way you feel a scar in cold weather. Old, familiar, no longer sharp enough to draw blood, only sharp enough to remind her that once it did. Camille stands just inside the ballroom entrance, one hand still resting on the doorframe, as though she needs it to stay upright. Her eyes move once, quickly, across the scene in front of her. Nora, unmistakably and impossibly pregnant, and 3 of the most powerful alpha women in the city, arranged around her not like ornaments, not like an entourage, but like a wall, built out of choice rather than obligation. Ava, Rowan, Celine. Camille knows all 3 names. Everyone in this room knows all 3 names. The Callaway Foundation's chief executive, the trauma surgeon half the hospital board owes favors to, the family law strategist whose retainer alone could fund a small nonprofit for a year. Camille has spent her professional life learning to read power the way other people read weather, and what she is reading right now makes no sense to her at all. What Camille does not know, what she cannot make her mind settle around, no matter how many times she runs the numbers, is how any of this happened. How the woman she once called Barren, in the ugliest voice she owned, is standing under a chandelier, 8 months pregnant, flanked by 3 women who look, unmistakably, like they would each burn the building down before they let anything touch her. Cars coming around, Ava says quietly, not to Camille, not to the room, only to Nora. 2 minutes. I'm fine, Nora says, though her breath has gone a little short, and the truth of that shortness sits uncomfortably close to a lie. You're fine, Rowan agrees, still holding her wrist, thumb resting lightly over the pulse. And we're still leaving in 2 minutes. Both things can be true. Celine doesn't speak yet. She simply stands where Camille would have to go through her to reach Nora, and Camille, to her own visible surprise, the surprise flickering plainly across a face she has spent years training into composure, does not try. Nora meets Camille's eyes across the room for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to see the shock still forming, the arithmetic Camille is doing behind her expression. A year, a diagnosis, a word she used once and never once took back. Not long enough to explain anything, not long enough, and not owed. She doesn't owe Camille an explanation, not tonight, maybe not ever again. Let's go, Nora says softly, and the 3 queens move around her at once, not like guards closing ranks, not like owners staking a claim, but like people who have each, individually and completely, decided that this woman's comfort outranks everything else happening in the room tonight. Behind them, Camille stands very still beneath the glass roof, one hand still braced against the doorframe, watching the woman she once discarded walk out on the arms of 3 women who clearly know exactly what that word cost her, and exactly how wrong it was to say it. For the first time in a year, Camille feels something close to fear, not of losing something, of having already lost it, completely, and only now understanding the size of what that loss actually was. The room, of course, has already begun to talk. It always does. A cluster of donors near the champagne table exchange glances that require no words, the kind of silent, practiced communication wealthy people, perfect at events exactly like this one. Someone murmurs a name, Camille's, low enough to seem discreet, not low enough to actually be discreet. Someone else murmurs another name in response. Half question, half confirmation. Wasn't there a divorce, a year or so back? Something about a diagnosis? Nora doesn't hear the specifics of what's being said. She doesn't need to. She has spent enough of her life inside rooms like this one, first as Camille's spouse, and now as something the room hasn't quite found language for yet, to recognize the particular hum of gossip assembling itself in real time. A year ago, that hum would have made her shrink. Tonight, walking out flanked by 3 women who have each, in their own separate way, made her feel like the most important person in any room she enters, she finds she has very little energy left to spend on strangers' whispered arithmetic. Let them talk. Let them wonder how a librarian once called Barren ended up carrying Triplets and 3 billionaire alphas' undivided loyalty. She isn't going to explain it to a room. She barely finished explaining it to herself. Nora doesn't look back. She has trained herself not to, the way you train yourself out of any habit that only ever hurt you. In the car, Rowan checks her pulse again out of habit rather than necessity, and Ava has already texted the driver twice, and Celine sits with her phone in her lap, unread messages waiting, her jaw set in the particular way it sets when she is filing something away to deal with later, rather than letting it derail the moment. You don't have to talk about it, Ava says, watching Nora's face in the dim interior light. I know, Nora says. I'm not going to. Not tonight. Rowan laces her fingers loosely through Nora's, not gripping, just present. Whenever you want to. Or never. Either one's fine by us. It is, Nora thinks, one of the strangest gifts anyone has ever given her. The permission to not perform an emotional reckoning on command, simply because someone from her past showed up unannounced. A year ago, she would have owed everyone in that room an explanation. Tonight, she owes no one anything, except the 3 women in this car, and even they aren't asking for one. The question sits in the room they left behind, though, unanswered and enormous. Why would 3 of the most powerful women in the city choose her, a librarian, a woman a wealthy alpha once called Barren, in front of witnesses? What could Nora possibly have that they didn't already own 100 times over? The answer, if anyone had asked Nora directly, would not have been simple. It would have taken a year to tell properly. It would have started, in fact, exactly 1 year earlier, in a small beige office that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. A year earlier, Nora had believed her life was small in the safest possible way. She worked afternoons at the Ashgrove Community Library, a squat brick building 3 blocks off the university district that the city kept threatening to close and that Nora kept refusing to let die. She cataloged donations. She wrote grant applications that never quite closed the budget gap. She organized story hours for children whose parents worked 2 jobs and couldn't afford the fancier programs downtown. It wasn't glamorous work, and she had never once wanted it to be. She was married to Camille, an alpha with a talent for making rooms feel important simply by walking into them, a rising executive at a biotech firm whose ambitions had, 4 years into their marriage, started to outgrow the modest life Nora had built for the 2 of them. For most of those 4 years, Nora believed that talent for making rooms feel important extended to making her feel important too. She would learn, eventually, that the 2 things had never actually been connected. The specialist's office was small and beige and smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Dr. Whitfield had a kind voice and an unkind chart, and she delivered the news with the particular gentleness of someone who has had this exact conversation too many times to count. There's thinning in the endometrial lining, Dr. Whitfield said, turning her tablet so Nora could see the images. Not that Nora understood much of what she was looking at. And there's an autoimmune marker here that complicates things further. It means conception is going to be difficult, not impossible. Difficult. Camille sat beside Nora in the stiff plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged into an expression of careful, professional concern that Nora would only later recognize as the same expression Camille wore in board meetings when a deal was about to fall through. Difficult meaning what, exactly? Camille asked. Percentages. Give me percentages. Dr. Whitfield glanced at Nora before answering, a small, apologetic flicker, as if she already sensed which one of them the numbers were really for. It varies. With treatment, with time, with the right protocol, many patients with this profile do conceive. It's a longer road. It requires patience. Camille heard difficult and heard longer road, and somewhere in the weeks that followed, she translated both of those words into a single word she never said to Nora's face until the night she finally did. It didn't happen all at once. That was the part Nora would replay for months afterward, lying awake trying to locate the exact hinge where her marriage had swung shut without her noticing the door move. Camille started working later. Meetings that used to end by 7 began stretching to 9, then 10. She started taking calls in the other room, the bedroom door closed, her voice pitched low enough that Nora couldn't make out words, only tone. And the tone was never the tone Camille used with her anymore. Dinner became a performance of normalcy neither of them fully committed to. Camille would ask about the library, and Nora would answer, and Camille's eyes would drift, mid-sentence, to somewhere just past Nora's shoulder, as though she were already living in a different room entirely. The affair, when Nora finally found it, wasn't even hidden particularly well, which in retrospect felt like its own kind of cruelty, as if Camille hadn't thought Nora worth the effort of a careful lie. A name, Priya, appeared in too many calendar entries marked simply as meeting. A hotel receipt sat folded in Camille's coat pocket, undestroyed, as if some part of Camille wanted to be caught, or didn't care enough to prevent it. Nora asked on a Tuesday evening, standing in their kitchen with the receipt flattened on the counter between them, like evidence in a trial neither of them had agreed to hold. Camille didn't deny it. She barely apologized. She stood on the other side of the counter with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the warmth Nora remembered from their wedding day, none of the softness from the early years, only a flat, exhausted certainty, as if she had rehearsed this moment many times already in her head. She can give me what I actually need, Camille said. What do you actually need, Camille? Nora's voice was very quiet. She already knew. She wanted to hear Camille say it anyway, the way you press on a bruise to confirm it still hurts. Children. Camille's eyes didn't waver. I need children, Nora. And you. She stopped herself, but not soon enough, and the pause that followed felt longer than the 4 years that had preceded it. Say it, Nora said. You're barren. The doctor practically said it herself. The word landed in the kitchen and seemed to change the temperature of the room entirely. Nora felt it settle into her chest, like something physical, a weight she would carry, unspoken, for the better part of a year. She thought, absurdly, of every dinner they'd shared at that same counter. Every ordinary Tuesday she'd assumed was simply the shape their life would keep taking. You don't get to say that, Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. You don't get to take one word from a doctor's careful sentence and turn it into a verdict just because it's convenient for you right now. I'm not trying to hurt you, Camille said, though her tone suggested otherwise, clipped and impatient, a woman already halfway out the door in every way that mattered. I'm being honest. Someone has to be honest eventually. Honest would have been telling me you wanted out before you found someone else to want in with. Honest would have been telling me the truth instead of hiding behind my own diagnosis like it's an excuse you get to use. Nora's hands were shaking now, though she kept them flat against the counter, refusing to let Camille see exactly how much the words had cost her. You didn't leave because I can't have children, Camille. You left because you didn't want to wait and find out. Those are different things, and you know it. Camille didn't answer that directly. She simply reached for her coat, already halfway to the decision she'd apparently made long before this conversation started, and left Nora standing alone in a kitchen that no longer felt like it belonged to either of them. The doctor had said difficult. Camille was the one who called her barren. Nora would think about that distinction more times than she could count in the year that followed. The doctor's careful, hopeful qualifier, and the word Camille chose instead, a word with no qualifier at all, a word designed to close a door, rather than describe one that was merely heavy to open. The divorce moved fast, the way things move when one party has better lawyers and the other party is still too stunned to fight properly. Nora lost the apartment they'd shared, a converted loft above a bakery that she'd loved more than she ever admitted out loud. She lost most of their shared savings, buried under a prenuptial clause she had signed in her 20s, back when she was too in love to read the fine print closely enough, back when she believed prenups were formalities, rather than blueprints for exactly this outcome. And because their insurance had been tied to Camille's executive plan, she lost her fertility treatment access in the same stroke of a pen that dissolved the marriage. The letter arrived 3 weeks after the papers were finalized, printed on plain corporate letterhead, informing her that her coverage under the Halbrook Biotech employee plan had been terminated, effective the date of the divorce decree. Just a closed door, stamped and mailed, arriving in her new, smaller mailbox like a final verdict. She called the insurance line anyway, sitting on the floor of her half-furnished apartment, with the letter spread open in front of her, hoping someone on the other end might tell her something different than what the page already said. The representative was polite, apologetic in the practiced, hollow way of someone reading from a script, and entirely unable to offer anything beyond what the letter had already confirmed. Coverage terminated. No riders available for former dependents. She was welcome, the representative said, to explore private insurance options, though anything covering her specific diagnosis would likely classify it as a pre-existing condition and price the treatment out of reach entirely. Nora sat on that floor for a long time after she hung up, the phone still warm in her hand, and did the math on what private fertility treatment actually cost without any insurance support behind it. A number so far beyond her library salary that it barely felt real, more like an abstraction than an actual obstacle she might someday need to solve. She didn't cry, not that night. She had already spent most of her tears in the weeks surrounding the divorce itself, and what remained in her, sitting on that floor, was something closer to a quiet, hardening resolve. She folded the letter, put it in a drawer she rarely opened, and told herself, with more conviction than she actually felt, that she would find another way eventually, even if she couldn't yet see what that way looked like. She had no idea, that night, how completely her life would eventually prove her right. She didn't lose the library. That at least remained hers, a battered, underfunded, structurally questionable building that the city kept threatening to shutter, and that Nora kept refusing, with a stubbornness that surprised even her, to let go of. In the weeks after the divorce, when everything else in her life had been divided, appraised, and taken, the library was the one place that still felt entirely her own. Before any of that, though, there were the 6 months in between, the months nobody writes gala speeches about, the unglamorous middle stretch where Nora simply had to learn how to be a person again. She moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, chosen mostly because it was the first place that didn't require a cosigner or a credit history that still had Camille's name tangled through it. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through them most nights, which she found, unexpectedly, less lonely than the silence of the loft she'd shared with Camille. At least the noise meant someone else was awake too. She stopped attending the dinners and fundraisers that had once filled her calendar as Camille's spouse, not because anyone uninvited her outright, but because the invitations simply stopped arriving, the way invitations do when the person who mattered to the guest list is no longer the person you're married to. She noticed, with a kind of flat, exhausted clarity, how many of the friendships from those years had belonged to the marriage rather than to her. Her mother called every Sunday and asked, gently, whether Nora had thought about trying again with someone new, as though the wound were a job opening rather than a fracture that hadn't finished setting. Nora usually let the question pass without answering it directly, She wasn't interested in trying again with anyone. She was still learning how to be alone in a room without flinching at the quiet. What she did have, in those 6 months, was the library. It became less a place she worked and more a place she rebuilt herself inside of, one grant application and one repaired shelf at a time. She learned the building's every water stain and creaking floorboard, the way she might once have learned a lover's habits. She stayed late most nights, not because the work demanded it, but because the empty apartment above the laundromat didn't offer much reason to hurry home. It was there, 6 months after the divorce, elbow deep in a box of water-damaged periodicals that the last flood had ruined beyond saving, that Ava Calloway walked in wearing a coat that cost more than Nora's monthly rent and asked, without any preamble at all, what it would take to save the building. Ava didn't come to the library because of Nora. She came because the Calloway Foundation had a mandate to fund community infrastructure, and Ashgrove had surfaced in a report as structurally unsound and chronically underfunded, one line item among dozens on a spreadsheet Ava had reviewed on her way to an entirely different meeting. She came for numbers, not sentiment. She stayed, over the following weeks, for reasons she was considerably slower to name, even to herself. Nora didn't perform gratitude for her, the way most grant recipients did. The practiced warmth, the careful deference, the performance people put on for money. She argued with Ava's proposed floor plan changes within the first 10 minutes of their first real conversation. She pushed back, twice, on donor conditions that would have restricted which books the library could keep on its shelves, conditions Ava's legal team had drafted without much thought, the kind of standard clauses no one usually questioned. "You could just sign it," Ava said one evening, the two of them alone in the reading room after hours, papers spread across a table that wobbled on one uneven leg no one had ever fixed. "The money's the same either way." "The money's the same," Nora agreed, not looking up from the clause she was underlining. "The library isn't. I'm not signing away control of what goes on these shelves, just because you're the one writing the check." Ava studied her for a long moment, the kind of look she usually reserved for board members trying to bluff their way through a negotiation. Most people folded under that look within seconds. Nora didn't fold at all. She just kept underlining, waiting for Ava to either argue or concede, entirely unbothered by which one Ava chose. "Fine," Ava said finally, and something in her voice had shifted, gone quieter, more genuine than the tone she used for donor calls. "Keep control. I'll fund it anyway." It wasn't romance yet. It was respect first, the kind that took root slowly, and only later grew into something warmer, something neither of them rushed. Ava restored the library's funding fully within a month, and true to her word, she gave Nora complete control. No strings attached, no board seat Nora hadn't asked for, no quiet, unspoken expectation that gratitude would eventually curdle into something transactional. She simply kept showing up. She kept arguing about floor plans on Thursday evenings. She kept staying long after the last patron had gone home, the two of them working in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional disagreement over paint colors or grant language. Somewhere in the 3rd month, Ava brought coffee without being asked, remembering exactly how Nora took it. Somewhere in the 4th month, Nora started saving the reading room's best chair for her, the one that didn't wobble, without ever mentioning that she'd started doing it. Neither of them named what was happening. Both of them noticed. It was Ava who eventually said something close to the truth out loud, though even then she said it sideways, the way people say the things that frighten them most. They were closing up the library on a night when the rain had kept every patron away, and Ava was helping stack chairs, an incongruous sight for a woman who ran a 9-figure foundation. "I don't usually stay this long anywhere," Ava said, not looking at Nora, focused instead on the chair in her hands. "I have a rule about it. In, evaluate, fund, out. It's how I've run every project for a decade." "And now?" Nora asked. "Now I've broken my own rule 11 times in a row, and I keep telling myself the 12th time will be the last one." Ava finally looked up. "It won't be, will it?" "No," Nora said. "Probably not." Ava didn't reach for her hand, She didn't say anything else about it either, that night. But she came back the following Thursday, and the one after that, and somewhere in the accumulation of Thursdays, the rules she'd built her entire professional life around simply stopped applying to this particular library, and to the woman who ran it. Rowan arrived differently, and later, and with considerably less warning. Rowan Ellery had spent 6 years as a combat medic. Before trading a war zone for a private practice, she ran mostly out of guilt, and mostly for people who couldn't afford anyone better. She kept her rates low enough that her accountant despaired of her regularly, and she kept a mobile clinic bag in her car at all times, a habit she'd never managed to unlearn even years after coming home. She met Nora on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, when Nora fainted in the library's back office from low blood pressure and a missed lunch she'd been too busy to remember eating. Ava, already a fixture there by then, in the office reviewing a grant timeline, called the only doctor she trusted enough to bring into a moment like this without turning it into a spectacle. Rowan's hands were steady, in a way that had nothing to do with confidence, and everything to do with years of practice, under conditions far worse than a cluttered library office. She checked Nora's pulse, her pupils, the color under her nails, and she did all of it while narrating exactly what she was doing and why, in a calm, unhurried voice that made the whole examination feel less like something being done to Nora and more like something being done with her. "I'm going to check your pulse now. Is that all right? I'd like to listen to your breathing for a second, if that's okay with you. Your blood pressure's a little low. Have you eaten today? Don't answer that if it's embarrassing. Just nod or shake your head." Nora, who had spent the last year of her marriage being touched without being asked, examined without being consulted, decided about without being included, noticed the asking before she noticed anything else about Rowan at all. "You always do that?" Nora asked, once the dizziness had passed and she was sitting upright again, a granola bar Ava had produced from somewhere held loosely in one hand. "Ask first?" "Always," Rowan said, packing her stethoscope back into its case with the efficient economy of someone who has done it 10,000 times. "People don't forget the one time somebody didn't. I'd rather be the doctor they don't remember being scared of." Rowan's humor arrived dry and unhurried, the kind that took Nora a few weeks to fully learn to catch, delivered so flatly that it was easy to miss the joke entirely if you weren't paying attention. She teased Ava mercilessly about her spreadsheets, calling her the woman who color codes her own grief. She teased herself more about her terrible parking, her habit of falling asleep in her scrubs on the library's least comfortable couch, her inability to remember anyone's birthday, except, somehow, always Nora's. But underneath the humor was a steadiness Nora had never had real access to before. A woman who showed up during medical scares, not because it was expected of her, not because a contract or a marriage certificate obligated her to, but because she'd decided, entirely on her own, without anyone asking her to decide it, that Nora mattered enough to interrupt her schedule for. She came to every follow-up appointment she could manage, sitting in waiting rooms with charts from her own practice balanced on her knees, working while she waited, never once making Nora feel like an inconvenience squeezed into a busy life. There was one night, a few months into their friendship, when Rowan let something slip past the humor entirely. Nora had asked, carefully, why she'd left the medical corps when she clearly still missed parts of it, and Rowan had gone quiet, in a way Nora hadn't seen from her before. The joke reflex switched off completely. "I lost someone I couldn't save," Rowan said finally, turning a coffee cup slowly in her hands instead of drinking from it. "A kid, barely 20, and I did everything right, every protocol, every second counted correctly, and he died anyway. I decided after that I'd rather spend the rest of my career on the patients other people give up on too early, the ones somebody already called a lost cause, before actually checking the numbers." "Is that what I am to you?" Nora asked. "A patient other people gave up on?" "You were," Rowan said. "You're not anymore. Now you're just someone I check on because I want to, not because I'm making up for anything." She finally looked up. "I need you to know the difference. I don't want you carrying somebody else's ghost by accident." Nora believed her. It was one of the only times in the last year she'd believed anything that immediately, without the small, automatic flinch of doubt she'd carried since the kitchen counter, and the word that started all of this. The first transfer failed. The second heartbeat was not alone. That came later, though. First, there was Celine. Celine Marchetti was a family law strategist with a reputation for reading contracts the way other people read weather. Instinctively, and always 3 steps ahead of the storm everyone else could only see once it had already arrived. She had built her career representing people who'd been outmaneuvered by better-funded opponents, and she had a particular, quiet fury reserved for cases where the outmaneuvering had happened through deliberate omission rather than honest disagreement. She met Nora through Ava, ostensibly to review the library's new grant terms for legal soundness, a favor between old colleagues that should have taken an afternoon. She stayed considerably longer, because somewhere in that first meeting, reviewing an unrelated stack of paperwork Nora had brought along out of habit, Celine noticed something in Nora's old divorce file that made her blood run cold. She didn't say anything at first. Celine had built her entire career on the principle that you don't act on a hunch until you've confirmed it fully, and confirming this particular hunch would mean digging through records Nora hadn't given her explicit permission to touch, so she sat on it. She let weeks pass, getting to know Nora properly, learning her the way she learned every case that mattered to her, carefully, thoroughly, without cutting corners. She learned that Nora ran the library's grant reports with a rigor most nonprofit directors never bothered with. She learned that Nora still kept, tucked in a desk drawer, a photograph from her wedding day that she hadn't yet found the strength to throw away, not out of longing, but out of some stubborn refusal to pretend the years hadn't happened. She learned that Nora laughed rarely but completely, her whole face changing when she did, and that Rowan had apparently made it something of a personal mission to earn that laugh at least once a week. Celine noticed all of it. She filed all of it away, the way she filed everything away, patient and precise. And eventually, months into their growing friendship, she brought the original thread back into the light. "I found something in your old insurance correspondence," she told Nora one evening, sitting across from her at the library's cracked reading table. The same table Ava had once spread contracts across. The same chair Rowan had once fallen asleep in. "I want to look into it further, but I won't, unless you say yes. It's your history, your call, not mine." Nora, who had learned by then, slowly and painfully, what it felt like to have decisions made about her body and her medical records, without her knowledge or consent, felt something loosen in her chest at being asked so plainly. "What did you find?" she asked. "I'd rather not guess out loud until I know for certain," Celine said. "Speculation isn't useful to you right now, but I think Camille knew more than she ever told you, about your treatment options, about what was actually possible, at the time she chose to leave." Nora sat with that for a long moment, the reading room quiet around them, the smell of old paper and cheap coffee settling over the silence like something familiar. "Do it," Nora said finally. "Look into it." Celine nodded once, and didn't ask again, and didn't rush to explain further, and that restraint, the refusal to push past a boundary the instant it was opened even slightly, was its own kind of gift. Nora said yes because Celine had waited for her to say it, patiently, without pressure, and that waiting was, in its own quiet way, a kind of proof that this woman would never take from her what wasn't freely offered. Later, Nora would ask her why she'd waited so long to bring it up at all, when Celine had clearly suspected something for weeks before finally speaking. "Because I've watched what happens when people get handed the truth before they're ready to hold it," Celine said. "I did family law for 12 years. I've sat across from clients who found out things about their own lives from a stranger's mouth instead of their own instincts, and it broke something in them that had nothing to do with the facts themselves. I wasn't going to do that to you. I'd rather you ask me than have me decide for you when you could handle it." "That's a very careful way to live," Nora said. "It's the only way I trust myself to live," Celine answered. "I've seen what happens when powerful people decide they know better than the person the information actually belongs to. I don't want to be one more person in your life who did that to you, even with good intentions. It was, Nora thought later, the exact opposite of what Camille had done with the buried appeal. A woman who had once decided, unilaterally, that Nora didn't need to know something that belonged to her, standing in sharp relief against a woman who refused to decide anything on Nora's behalf without her permission first. It wasn't only Nora who had to navigate what was happening. At some point, inevitably, Ava, Rowan, and Celine had to sit across from each other without Nora in the room and figure out what they were actually building, separately from what each of them individually felt for her. The conversation happened on Ava's initiative. In her office after hours, the three of them arranged around a conference table, usually reserved for foundation board meetings. Ava had never been good at small talk when something larger needed addressing directly. "I think we all know why we're here," she said. "I'd rather we say it plainly than let it turn into something unspoken and messy. I care about her. I think both of you do too. I don't think that's a problem, as long as none of us turn it into a competition." Rowan leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, considering. "I'm not interested in competing with either of you. I've watched what it costs people to fight over someone, instead of just supporting them. I'd rather be one of 3 good things in her life than the only thing, if the only thing means she has to choose." Celine, characteristically, had already thought this through with more precision than either of them. Legally and practically speaking, nothing about this needs to be exclusive, unless we decide it does. Nora isn't a contract with one signature line. If she wants all 3 of us, and if the 3 of us can manage that honestly, without jealousy curdling into control, I don't see the problem. "And if she doesn't want all 3 of us?" Ava asked. "If she chooses one of us, eventually?" The question sat in the room for a long moment. It was Rowan who finally answered it. "Then that's her call to make, and none of us gets to be bitter about it. That's the deal. As far as I'm concerned, we support her. We don't corner her into deciding faster than she's ready to. And whatever she chooses, we don't punish her for choosing it." Ava and Celine both nodded, and something settled between the 3 of them that night that none of them ever needed to revisit again, not out of avoidance, but because the agreement had been made honestly the first time, and honest agreements tend to hold. Each queen had earned something different. In the months that followed, none of it claimed, all of it given. Ava had earned trust through restraint, power that never once leaned on Nora, wealth that never once became leverage. Rowan had earned it through consent, hands that never moved before permission, care that never assumed. Celine had earned it through patience, truth that waited for invitation, instead of forcing its way into a life that had already been forced into enough. None of them had earned Nora by claiming her. They had earned her, slowly, deliberately, by refusing to. The fertility clinic Ava quietly funded, not as a condition of anything between them, not as a transaction dressed up as generosity, simply as a gift Nora was allowed to accept or refuse on her own terms, became the site of the next chapter, the one Nora had least expected to reach at all, after the letter that had once closed that door so completely. The paperwork alone took weeks. Celine reviewed every clause of the new treatment agreement before Nora signed anything, catching a liability provision buried in page 9 that would have shifted unnecessary financial risk onto Nora if a cycle failed. "You don't have to fight for a door that's already open," Celine told her, striking the clause with a red pen and sliding the revised page back across the table. "Let me fight the parts that still need fighting." The first embryo transfer failed. Nora had known the odds going in, had read every statistic Dr. Whitfield handed her, had braced herself as thoroughly as anyone can brace for disappointment they already expect. It didn't matter. She cried in the clinic parking lot afterward anyway, not because she'd truly expected success, but because failure still hurt in a place that grief hadn't fully closed over, a place that had been raw since the night Camille said the word Barren across a kitchen counter. Rowan sat beside her in the car and didn't say anything comforting, because there wasn't anything comforting to say that wouldn't ring hollow, and instead she simply held space, steady, present, unhurried, one hand resting lightly on Nora's shoulder, saying nothing at all until Nora was ready to drive. I keep thinking she was right, Nora finally said, staring at the parking lot's gray concrete through a windshield gone blurry with rain that hadn't actually started falling yet. That maybe the word wasn't wrong, just early. She wasn't right, Rowan said, quiet and certain. One failed transfer isn't a verdict. It's a data point. I've watched 100 cycles fail before the 101st worked. The math doesn't care what Camille called you, neither do I. The second transfer took differently. At the 6-week scan, the ultrasound technician went quiet in a way that made Nora's stomach drop immediately, bracing for the worst, until the quiet resolved unexpectedly into a small, startled laugh. There's more than one heartbeat, the technician said, turning the monitor so Nora could see. There's 3. Triplets. An embryo that had unexpectedly divided, then divided again, defying odds that Dr. Whitfield herself would later describe, in the careful, professional language of someone still faintly amazed by her own field, as remarkable. Nora sat with the news for a long time before she let herself feel anything about it beyond disbelief, staring at 3 small flickering shapes on a screen that had, months earlier, shown her nothing at all. And when the feeling did finally arrive, it wasn't validation. It wasn't a scoreboard flipping decisively in her favor after a year of Camille's cruelty. She refused, deliberately and consciously, to let the pregnancy become evidence in an argument she no longer had any interest in continuing to have. I'm not carrying these babies to prove her wrong, she told Ava one night, the two of them sitting on the library's back steps, the sky over Ashgrove gone violet with early evening, the kind of hour that made even a cracked sidewalk look almost beautiful. I'm carrying them because I want them. Because I chose this, finally, on my own terms. Those are different things. Ava, who understood the difference between winning and simply living better than most people ever learned to, only nodded, and reached over to take Nora's hand, and said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. The decision to actually begin treatment wasn't made alone, and it wasn't made quickly. Nora remembered the evening clearly. All 3 of them gathered in the library's reading room after hours, the same wobbling table between them, because by then, it had become something like their unofficial meeting place, the room where the important conversations happened. I need to say the difficult thing out loud, Nora told them, which is that I might go through all of this and still end up with nothing. I need you to understand that before I start, because I don't want any of you standing beside me out of momentum instead of choice. Then let's talk about it honestly, Celine said, setting down the folder she'd brought, the revised treatment agreement already tabbed and annotated, because I don't think any of us are here out of momentum. I'm here because you asked me to look into your options, and I did, and they're better than you were told they were. I'm here because I've watched people survive worse odds than yours, Rowan added. And because if it doesn't work, I'd rather be in the room for that too than pretend I only show up for the good outcomes. Ava, who had been quiet, finally spoke. I'm here because I don't actually care whether it works. I care whether you get to make the attempt on your own terms this time, instead of having the choice taken from you by somebody else's timeline. That's the only thing that matters to me in this room tonight. Nora looked at the 3 of them for a long moment, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in over a year. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something with room in it for failure, that didn't feel like the end of anything. Okay, she said. Then let's start. By the time the pregnancy became visibly obvious, all 3 queens had folded themselves into Nora's life, in ways that felt less like an arrangement, and more like a slow, mutual recognition. None of them had planned, but none of them resisted either. Ava attended every Foundation-adjacent obligation with Nora at her side, never performing possession, never introducing her as anything other than exactly who she was, simply offering presence without demand. Rowan came to every appointment she could manage, still narrating, still asking, tracking every measurement with the quiet vigilance of someone who had once kept people alive under conditions with far fewer safety nets than a modern maternity ward. Celine kept working steadily in the background, chasing the thread she'd first noticed in Nora's old insurance file, waiting patiently for the right moment to pull it fully into the light, unwilling to force a revelation Nora hadn't asked for until she was certain of every fact. That moment arrived, in the end, at the gala. The same gala where this story began, 3 queens rising around a heavily pregnant Nora the instant Camille walked through the door, none of them planning the confrontation, all of them simply reacting, instantly and completely, to protect someone they had each, separately, decided was worth protecting. Camille had not lost the appeal. She had signed it away. Celine found the document 2 weeks before the gala, buried deep in an archive of insurance correspondence that Camille's legal team had apparently assumed no one would ever bother to request, filed under a case number that had nothing obviously to do with Nora's name. An appeal, submitted on Nora's behalf during the final tense weeks of their marriage, approving expanded fertility treatment coverage despite the earlier diagnosed complications, a door that Dr. Whitfield's office had apparently pushed open on Nora's behalf, without either of them fully realizing it, back when the marriage was still, technically, intact. Approved, signed, and never once mentioned to Nora, not in a single conversation, not in a single passing comment, not even in the brutal kitchen confrontation where Camille had chosen instead to say a much crueler, much less accurate word. Camille had read the approval letter the same week she began the affair with Priya. She had chosen, deliberately and with what Celine's research suggested was full awareness of what she was doing, not to tell her wife that a door thought closed had, in fact, swung open at the exact moment Camille needed it to stay shut, in order to justify the choice she'd already started making. "She had a way out for you," Celine told Nora quietly. The papers spread between them on the library's cracked reading table, the same table where so much of the last year had unfolded, and she buried it instead of giving it to you. She let you believe biology had failed you completely, when really, she was the one who failed to hand you the paperwork that said otherwise. Nora read the document twice, her hands steady in a way that surprised her. She felt, distantly, a version of the anger she might have expected to feel reading something like this. But mostly what she felt, sitting in that quiet reading room with 3 fully formed heartbeats moving inside her, was clarity, sharp and clean and almost peaceful. Camille hadn't left because Nora couldn't have children. Camille had left because Camille wanted certainty more than she had ever wanted Nora, and the appeal, with its promise of a longer, harder, still possible road, had been deeply inconvenient to a narrative Camille had already decided to believe. "Why would she do that?" Nora said. Not really a question, more a thought spoken aloud. Why go through the trouble of hiding it, instead of just leaving honestly? Because honest would have meant admitting she left because she didn't want to wait, Celine said. Barren was easier to say than impatient. It made her the victim of biology, instead of the author of her own decision. Later, in the private study of her downtown office, Camille would describe that same decision very differently to the handful of people who ever dared ask her about it directly. She would call it medical necessity. She would say she had simply moved faster than the paperwork could, that waiting for an uncertain outcome wasn't a luxury her timeline could afford. It was, she told herself in the months and then the year that followed, the only honest way to explain a choice she had made too easily and had come, slowly and privately, to regret far more than she would ever admit out loud to anyone who mattered. In the quiet of that study, late at night, Camille sometimes allowed herself a version of the truth she never spoke aloud to anyone. She would pour a drink she didn't finish and sit with the appeal letter's memory, the one she'd read once, and filed away in a drawer she eventually stopped opening. She told herself, in those private hours, that she'd been protecting her own timeline, her own certainty, her own need to control an outcome that medicine had refused to guarantee her. She rarely let herself finish the thought that came after that one, the thought that certainty had never actually been the thing she lost by staying. It was Nora. She had traded a woman for a guarantee, and the guarantee, in the end, had cost her Priya too, once the new relationship discovered exactly how easily Camille discarded people who no longer served a purpose. She followed Nora's progress after the divorce, in ways she never admitted to anyone. A mutual acquaintance's offhand comment about the library's new funding, a name she recognized from a Foundation Gala guest list, a slow accumulation of small facts that eventually assembled themselves into a picture she wasn't prepared for. By the time she saw Nora pregnant beneath the gala's glass roof, the shock on her face wasn't performance. It was a full year of buried arithmetic finally arriving at its sum. She did not know, until the night of the gala, that the paperwork had survived. That someone had found it, patiently and thoroughly, exactly the way Celine found everything. That the someone standing now at Nora's side, immovable as a fact no argument could overturn, was the very person who now held that paperwork in a folder Camille had no legal standing left to touch. The gala should have ended quietly. It did not. Nora felt the first contraction just after the private car pulled up outside her building, 3 weeks earlier than anyone had planned for, a tightening low in her belly that stole her breath entirely for a moment before releasing it. Rowan was out of the car, and beside her before the second contraction hit, her voice dropping into the low, even register she used only in genuine emergencies. Calm not because the situation itself was calm, but because Nora needed to hear that particular calm more than she needed anything else right now. "Hospital, now," Rowan said, already timing the gap between contractions on the stopwatch feature of her phone, already moving Nora toward the car with careful, practiced hands. "Ava, call ahead." "Celine." "On it," Celine said, already moving, already dialing the number of the OBGYN she'd had on standby for exactly this possibility since the moment the pregnancy had passed 30 weeks, a contingency plan she'd quietly built without ever mentioning it, because that was simply how Celine operated, prepared for every version of the worst before anyone else had finished hoping for the best. 3 queens had promised to protect Nora. None of them could promise 3 surviving heartbeats. The delivery room, when they finally reached it, was too bright and too fast, a blur of monitors and gowned staff, and Rowan's hand gripping Nora's tightly, still asking, even now, even in the middle of an emergency, "Can I stay right here? Is this okay with you?" As though consent mattered more in crisis, not less. As though the habit of asking had become so deeply a part of who Rowan was, that fear couldn't shake it loose even for a second. "Stay," Nora managed between breaths. "Please stay." Ava stood just outside the sterile line, phone pressed to her ear, cutting through hospital administration, with the particular ruthlessness of a woman who had spent her entire life making institutions move faster than they wanted to, securing a specialist neonatal team on standby before anyone had even confirmed the babies would need one, simply because she refused to wait for permission to prepare for the worst. Celine stood beside her, watching the corridor, because Camille, who had followed the ambulance despite no one inviting her, who had apparently been unable to stop herself once she saw Nora doubled over outside the gala, was pacing the hallway outside, carrying an old marital record she still, almost unbelievably, seemed to believe gave her some remaining claim to the room. "You don't have standing here," Celine told her, quiet and precise, blocking the doorway without ever raising her voice above a level meant only for the 2 of them. "That document expired the day the divorce was finalized. You know that better than almost anyone in this hospital. You used to write contracts for a living. Don't pretend you've forgotten how expiration dates work. I have a right to know if she's—" "You have no rights here," Celine said, and something in her voice, quiet as it stayed, carried enough weight to finally stop Camille mid-sentence. "You gave those up the day you decided a word mattered more than a woman. What you have is the option to wait out here, quietly, and hope someone chooses to update you. That's it. That's all that's left." Camille arrived at the hospital carrying a marriage record that was no longer hers to use. Celine made sure it stayed that way, standing in that doorway for as long as it took, unmoving, until Camille finally sank into a waiting room chair and stopped arguing altogether. Ava found her there sometime later, between phone calls, when the immediate crisis inside the delivery room had quieted enough for her to step away for a moment. She hadn't planned to speak to Camille at all, but Camille looked so entirely reduced, sitting in that plastic chair with her expensive coat crumpled beside her. that Ava found herself pausing anyway. "She's stable," Ava said, offering the one piece of information she was certain Camille wanted most and had no right to ask for directly. "Both babies delivered are stable. The third is still in progress." Camille looked up, startled that Ava had spoken to her at all. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because whatever else is true, you spent 4 years married to her, and no one should sit in a hospital hallway not knowing," Ava said. "That's not kindness toward you. It's just not needless cruelty towards someone who's already lost everything she's going to lose tonight." She paused. "You're not getting anything more than that, though. Not tonight, and not after." "I don't expect to," Camille said quietly, and for once, there was no argument left in her voice at all. Ava studied her for a moment longer, unable to entirely suppress a flicker of something that wasn't quite sympathy, but lived somewhere near it. "For what it's worth, the word you used, it wasn't just wrong about her body, it was wrong about her, completely. She built a foundation-funded library restoration, survived a diagnosis you turned into a weapon, and is currently delivering 3 children you told her she'd never have. I hope you understand exactly how wrong you were, in every direction." She walked back into the delivery ward without waiting for a response, and Camille sat alone in the hallway, with nothing left to say to the empty space where the argument used to be. Inside, the second baby delivered without complication, a small, furious cry filling the room within seconds of arrival. The third did not come so easily. A monitor's rhythm dropped, then dropped again, and for 11 seconds that felt considerably unbearably longer, the room went taut with a silence that had nothing gentle in it at all. Rowan's training took over before her fear could catch up to it. She called it, sharp and clear, cutting through the tension with the exact tone she'd once used in far worse rooms than this one, and the neonatal team moved as a single coordinated unit. Nora, exhausted past the point of coherent thought, terrified in a way that had nothing performative in it, gripped Rowan's hand hard enough to leave a mark, and did not let go, could not have let go, until the cry finally came, small, furious, unmistakably alive. 3 heartbeats, all 3, ragged but steady, in the room at last. Ava, standing just outside, heard the third cry through the doorway, and closed her eyes for a moment, the first visible crack in her composure in months. Celine, still stationed at the door, allowed herself exactly one breath of relief before returning her attention to the hallway, to Camille, to the small, tense vigil that wasn't yet finished. Camille didn't ask to see the babies that night. She waited 3 days, until Nora had been moved out of intensive recovery and into a private room, and the initial danger had folded itself into an ordinary, manageable recovery process, before she asked, quietly, through Celine, because Celine was still, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, the only version of Camille's old life that would still speak to her directly. Nora agreed to 5 minutes. Not for Camille's sake. Camille stood at the foot of the hospital bed, looking at 3 impossibly small, impossibly real infants asleep in their bassinets, and said the thing she had apparently been rehearsing, her voice steadier than Nora expected, though her hands weren't. "I was wrong! I was wrong! About the word I used, about what I assumed and how easily I assumed it. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I know I don't get that back." Nora studied her for a long moment. This woman who had once made her feel small enough to disappear entirely, standing small herself now, in a hospital doorway, looking at 3 lives she'd once declared impossible. "You're right," Nora said finally. "You don't get that back. Regret doesn't restore access, Camille. It doesn't undo 4 years, or the appeal you buried and never told me about, or the entire year I spent believing my body had failed me, when it was you who failed to hand me the paperwork that said I still had a chance." Camille's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue, didn't offer excuses, didn't reach for the old habit of turning every conversation into something she could win. That, at least, was new. "I'm not asking for anything," Camille said quietly. "I just needed you to hear it from me directly, not through Celine, not through a headline, from me." "You've said it," Nora said. "Now you can go." Camille left without another word, without lingering, without the performance of grief she might once have staged for an audience. It was, in its own small way, the first entirely honest exit Nora had ever seen her make. A week later, at a follow-up gala the Callaway Foundation hosted specifically for the hospital's neonatal unit, an event Ava had scheduled months earlier without any knowledge of how it would ultimately intersect with Nora's story, Camille stood in front of the same crowd that had watched her call Nora Barren a year earlier, and corrected the record herself, publicly, without being asked to and without anyone forcing her hand. She didn't frame it as redemption. She framed it, simply and plainly, as fact. The diagnosis had said difficult, not impossible, and the difficulty had never been the real reason their marriage ended. She said it in front of donors, in front of colleagues, in front of people whose opinions had once mattered enormously to her career. And she said it without flinching, though it clearly cost her something significant to do so. It cost her something to say it. Nora, watching from across the room with 3 queens beside her, and 3 infants safely at home in a nursery Ava had quietly furnished, without asking permission first, found she no longer needed to witness what that cost looked like up close. She had already gotten everything from Camille that she was ever going to need. The naming happened quietly, in the hospital's private room, days before any of them had the energy for a bigger conversation about what came next. Nora had thought about names throughout the pregnancy, in an abstract, unfocused way, never quite settling on anything, as though some part of her hadn't fully let herself believe she'd get to use them. "I don't want to name them after anyone from before," she said, one of the triplets asleep against her chest, the other 2 in their bassinets nearby. Not out of anger, just, I want their names to belong only to this part of the story. Rowan, sitting in the chair beside the bed, with the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't properly slept in 3 days, considered this. Then name them for what actually happened, not the bad part, the part where it turned out fine anyway. They settled, eventually, on names that meant something only the 4 of them would ever fully understand. Nothing borrowed from Camille's side of the story, nothing that echoed the 4 years Nora had spent in a marriage built on a word that turned out to be a lie. Celine cried, briefly, and only once, when Nora asked if she'd be listed as a legal guardian alongside Ava and Rowan, an offer Celine hadn't expected and clearly hadn't prepared herself to receive. "You don't have to say yes," Nora added quickly, misreading the tears. "I just wanted you to know the option exists." "I'm not upset," Celine said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, laughing a little at herself. "I've spent 12 years drafting documents that protect other people's families. I never thought I'd end up asked to be part of one, instead of just the paperwork behind it." "Is that a yes?" "That's absolutely a yes." The first weeks home were harder than any of them had braced for, in the particular way that new parenthood always outpaces preparation, no matter how many books you've read or contingency plans you've built. 3 infants meant someone was always awake, always needed, always mid-crisis, over something that would resolve itself in 90 seconds and somehow still feel enormous in the moment. Ava, who had spent her entire career mastering rooms full of people twice her age, discovered she had absolutely no authority whatsoever over a 6-week-old who simply refused to be soothed by anything resembling logic. She paced the nursery at 3 in the morning, murmuring quarterly projections under her breath, because it was the only calm, steady thing she had readily available to say, and somehow, against all reasonable expectation, it worked more often than lullabies did. Rowan turned out to be, unsurprisingly, the calmest of the 3 during actual emergencies. A fever, a feeding refusal, a worrying cough, and the most rattled during the ordinary chaos of an average Tuesday, baffled that nothing in her medical training had prepared her for the specific exhaustion of 3 overlapping nap schedules. Celine color-coded everything: the feeding logs, the pediatrician appointments, the household division of labor, all of it organized into a spreadsheet the other 2 teased her mercilessly about, and secretly, privately, relied on completely. And Nora, in the middle of all of it, found something she hadn't expected to find this quickly: Not just recovery, not just healing, but an entirely new version of steadiness, built out of 3 separate, deliberate kinds of love that had never once asked her to shrink herself to fit inside them. Several weeks later, the townhouse Ava had quietly helped Nora find, close enough to the library that Nora could walk there some mornings, large enough for 3 cribs, and considerably more chaos than any of the 4 of them had ever planned for, settled into its first real evening of ordinary domestic life. Rowan sat on the floor of the nursery, with one triplet asleep against her chest, still narrating everything she did out of a habit that clearly wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Repositioning now, just adjusting your blanket, nothing scary happening here. Celine stood in the doorway with a folder of paperwork she had, for once in her professional life, decided could wait until morning. An uncharacteristic concession that made Nora smile when she noticed it. Ava leaned against the frame, watching the room with an expression none of them had quite seen on her face before. Something unguarded, something that had shed every last trace of boardroom composure. "We're not here to make a claim," Ava said finally, when the room had gone quiet enough for the words to land properly. No monitors beeping, no hospital corridors, no crisis pulling everyone's attention in 3 directions at once. None of us. "We didn't do any of this because we expected something back for it." "We're asking," Rowan added, shifting the sleeping infant slightly against her shoulder, "if we get to stay. All of it, however you want to define it, on your terms, not because you owe anyone anything for the last year." Celine said nothing at first, but she looked at Nora the way she'd once looked at that buried insurance document. Patient, careful, waiting for permission before moving another inch closer, still unwilling, even now, to assume anything she hadn't been explicitly given. Nora looked at the 3 of them, standing there in a nursery none of them had needed to help build, and then looked at the 3 small lives asleep in their cribs, lives that existed now because of a chain of choices that had started with a cruel word in a kitchen, and ended, somehow, impossibly, here. She understood, with a clarity that had taken a year and a diagnosis, and a divorce, and 3 separate, deliberate kinds of trust to finally arrive at, that this was not a question with only one predetermined right answer waiting patiently to be discovered. It was a question only she could answer, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the answer belonged entirely, completely, to her alone. "Stay," she said. Nobody moved right away. It wasn't the kind of word that needed a dramatic response. No embrace staged for effect. No tears manufactured for the moment. Instead, Rowan simply shifted the sleeping infant a little higher on her shoulder and let out a breath she'd apparently been holding. Celine set her folder down on the hallway table, finally and completely done with it for the night. Ava crossed the room and settled onto the floor beside Rowan, an unlikely position for a woman who ran board meetings from the head of a table, and reached out to rest one hand lightly against the edge of the nearest crib. Nora watched the 3 of them settle into that ordinary, unremarkable moment. No gala, no crisis, no chandelier, just a nursery and 3 sleeping infants and 3 women who had each, in their own time and their own way, decided she was worth staying for, and understood that this was the actual ending of the story that had started a year earlier in a beige office with an unkind chart and a kind voice. Not the gala, not the headline, not even the moment Camille corrected herself in front of a crowd. This, a quiet room, chosen freely, by someone who had finally learned that she got to do the choosing. A few days later, Nora brought all 3 infants to the library for the first time, propped in a triple stroller Ava had researched, with the same relentless thoroughness she once brought to due diligence reports. The staff gathered around, delighted, and one of the regular patrons, an elderly man who had been coming in every Wednesday for years to read the newspaper in the same chair, looked at the 3 sleeping babies, and then at Nora with a knowing, unhurried smile. "Whole different life than the one you had in here a year ago," he said. "Whole different life," Nora agreed. She wheeled the stroller past the reading room table, where Ava had once refused to let a donor's conditions dictate what stayed on the shelves, past the chair Rowan had once fallen asleep in during a long, uneventful evening shift, past the corner where Celine had first said the words, "I found something. I won't look further unless you say yes." Every piece of the building held a piece of the last year inside it now, layered over the version of herself that had once stood in this same room believing her life had been permanently, quietly diminished by a single word spoken in a kitchen. It hadn't been diminished. It had simply been waiting for the right people to walk through the door. Nora had not become valuable because 3 queens chose her. They were allowed to stay because she had finally chosen herself. Which queen do you think earned Nora's trust first? Ava, Rowan, or Celine? And was Camille's apology enough? Tell us in the comments below. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe for next week's release.